The vastness of space around Vesper 7 seemed to swallow all light, a dense and impenetrable darkness that made that icy moon even more inhospitable. On the main display of the Nautilus 3, the image remained fixed on something that shouldn't be there. A metallic structure floated in the moon's unstable orbit, a cold, intact silhouette, completely still. It was the Ardent Dawn, a ship that should have been devoured by the void 2 decades earlier. The mission team stared silently at the screen, as if at any moment the thing might move on its own. There were no signs of response, no automatic communications, no lights on in the internal corridors. It was a metal ghost, a floating tomb stuck in time. Dr. Elias Mercer, observing the scene from the command center, stood motionless for a moment. He had been involved in many rescue missions, had studied wreckage of forgotten ships, but this was different. There was something wrong, something inherently wrong with that image. His heart pounded, but his mind searched for patterns, logical explanations, anything that could turn primitive fear into rationality. Before anyone could speak, a chilling thought crossed his mind. If the Ardent Dawn was there, then where had its crew gone? Now I ask you, who are following this mystery? What do you think really happened to this ship? Leave your guess in the comments. The Nautilus 3 approached cautiously. Protocol demanded that probes be sent first, but the silence of the Ardent Dawn heightened the urgency of the mission. The ship was tied to a secret that should never have been forgotten, and Mercer knew his involvement was no coincidence. 2 engineers, Katya Lin and Rafik Solano, were preparing their suits for a manual docking. The scanner detected no heat signatures, no internal movement. The only indication of life on board were the enigmatic signals detected by the Vesper 7 station, a fragmented transmission coming from inside the lost ship. Mercer and the mission commander, Victor Henshaw, watched as the small connection module latched onto the outer hatch. The sound of metal echoed through the Nautilus 3's internal speakers, a dull impact that resonated deeply in everyone's mind. When Katya initiated the hatch opening, the pressure stabilized without issue, as if the ship had been waiting to be opened. The air inside the Ardent Dawn was breathable, but it had a strange smell, not of rot, but something indefinable, metallic, electrical, as if the structure itself had retained echoes of something that had once been there. The engineers moved down the corridors while Mercer monitored from the external panel. Communication was clear, but Katya's words were the first sign that something was amiss. It's like no one ever left. Everything's in place. Rafik confirmed it. No signs of looting, no damage. The Ardent Dawn didn't look like an abandoned ship. It looked like a place frozen in time. The team moved through the silent corridors, their flashlights scanning the halls and revealing panels still intact, monitors blinking in standby. There was nothing to suggest an emergency evacuation. Whatever had happened there, it wasn't a sudden malfunction. It was something meticulous. Mercer felt a growing unease as he followed the data. It was impossible for a ship abandoned for so long to be this well preserved. Even the dust seemed not to accumulate, as if time itself had been erased inside the Ardent Dawn. Katya and Rafik reached the command cabin, where most of the answers should have been. The logbook was active, but the communication logs seemed incomplete. The last entry was dated 22 years ago, on the very day the ship disappeared. The video showed the mission's captain, Jonas Reeve, looking tense. The recording was distorted, but parts of his words could still be understood. If anyone is listening, get out of here. We are not ourselves. The Ardent Dawn is... The sound cut out, and then something strange happened. The captain's image seemed to flicker, his face shifting slightly out of alignment with reality. For a second, it was as if there were 2 versions of Jonas Reeve superimposed, like an error in the very structure of the video. Then the screen went black. Silence took over the communication channel. Katya and Rafik exchanged nervous glances. Mercer closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the tension under his skin. What the hell had happened there? He asked them to restart the logs, but the ship's systems began to behave erratically. Some lights flickered for no apparent reason. Sensors picked up movement where there was no one. The silence started to become oppressive. Then Rafik spoke, his voice trembling. The clocks. Mercer frowned, adjusting the monitor to see the readings. What he saw made his blood run cold. Every clock belonging to the crew had stopped at the exact same second. Katya swallowed hard, running her fingers over the panel. No ship could experience such a precise, coordinated failure. The record showed that every onboard device had stopped at 3:14 a.m. on the day the Ardent Dawn disappeared. But how? Mercer took a deep breath. They needed more answers before drawing any conclusions. The first priority was to access the internal files and the cryostasis sectors. If there was any chance of finding traces of the crew, that was where they would be. Before they could move, a sound spread through the ship's corridors. Something was coming from the internal speakers. Mercer immediately adjusted the controls to isolate the frequency. At first, it was just white noise, an irregular hiss, like a lost radio signal full of interference. But then something emerged behind the static, heavy breathing. Everyone on the Nautilus 3 froze as they heard it, a collective pause, as if time itself held its breath. It was rhythmic, almost human, but there hadn't been anyone on board for 22 years. Rafik tried to cut off the signal, but before he could act, a single word broke the silence. A low, distorted voice whispered through the Ardent Dawn speakers, "Open the door." For a moment, nobody moved. The sound reverberated through the Ardent Dawn speakers, spreading like a whisper that shouldn't exist. "Open the door." Two simple words that carried an impossible weight. Katya Lin looked at Rafik Solano, and both felt ice creeping up their spines. Mercer, on the other side of the communication, tried to stay calm, rationalizing what had happened. Perhaps it was a transmission error, a corrupted recording triggered by the ship's failing systems. But the breathing, the cadence of that request, it was something alive. The ensuing silence was even worse. Neither of the engineers moved, as if the air around them had become too dense to allow any action. Mercer broke the hesitation, instructing them to check the source of the signal. No logical explanation appeared on the monitors. The message wasn't stored in any of the Ardent Dawn's files. The voice had come from somewhere inside the ship. Katya tried to open the transmission back to the Nautilus III, but the external communication channel was plagued by interference. Something within that ship was blocking contact. Mercer frowned. The first step was to locate the origin of the signal. The second was to decide whether they really wanted to open that door. And you? What would you do in their place? Stay to investigate or leave the Ardent Dawn behind? Answer in the comments before continuing. The metal corridors of the Ardent Dawn seemed to narrow as Katya and Rafik advanced, their flashlights cutting through the bluish gloom of the emergency panels. The metallic smell lingered in the air, an artificial electric scent like burnt ozone mixed with something indefinable. Every terminal they tried to access showed the same pattern: corrupted records, truncated files, incomplete reports. The Ardent Dawn should have been in disarray after 2 decades adrift, but it seemed untouched, as if someone, or something, had continued keeping the ship in a state of suspension. When they reached the main door to the cryostasis wing, Rafik stopped. His monitor blinked with an alert. The power in that section seemed unstable, as though it was operating in 2 states at once, on and off. That was impossible. Katya activated the door panel, and the locks responded almost instantly, a hydraulic hum echoing through the corridors. The air inside the cryostasis room was far too cold, even by the ship's standards. But what made them hesitate wasn't the temperature, it was the capsules. They were empty. All the cryostasis units stood open, but there were no bodies. No signs of escape, nothing indicating an evacuation. Just unoccupied metal beds, as if the crew had never existed. Katya approached the central terminal. The display flickered, numbers wavering. Mercer followed the readings from outside, his mind racing. Logs showed that all the capsules had been activated simultaneously at the exact second the ship disappeared 22 years ago. There was no technical failure. Someone or something had opened all of them at once. But why? That was when the lights in the cryostasis room flickered. For a brief moment, the shadows shifted. Katya stepped back, eyes wide. She could have sworn that, for a fraction of a second, someone was there. A figure in the corner of her vision, standing among the empty capsules. Rafik spun around, his sensors trying to pick up any sign of movement. Nothing. The silence returned. Mercer felt his stomach turn. They were not alone. The Ardent Dawn was not empty. But if the crew had vanished, what remained in their place? Katya closed the terminal display. They had to get out of there. They had stayed on board long enough to feel that something was watching them. The idea that the place was suspended in time became more tangible by the second, but in a way that defied all logic. The Ardent Dawn wasn't just an abandoned ship, it was a rift in reality, a point where the known rules simply did not apply, and they had just gone too far inside. The return to the connection module was tense. Each step seemed too loud. Each shadow on the walls took on a life of its own. But when they finally reached the hatch, the worst happened. The control panel shut down. No commands, no response. The only path back to the Nautilus 3 was now blocked. Mercer tried to restore control from outside, but the ship's systems were failing one by one. The communication signal remained plagued by static. And then, the ship's internal speaker came alive again. The breathing, louder this time, closer. The open channel allowed everyone on the Nautilus 3 to hear it as well. And for a moment, time froze. A new phrase was uttered. A cold, distorted voice whispered through the system. "Why did you open the capsules?" The panel remained silent. Katya pressed the controls again, her fingers moving urgently, but the outcome was always the same. None. Access to the escape hatch was denied. The corridor lights flickered, throwing restless shadows across the metal walls. Rafik clenched his fists, feeling a chill creep over his neck. Mercer, still on the Nautilus 3, struggled to regain remote control over the Ardent Dawn's systems, but it was as if the ship were sealing itself around them, rewriting its own rules as needed. The voice in the speaker still echoed in their minds. "Why did you open the capsules?" The question was a warning, an accusation, a lament. But who, or what, was speaking? Katya looked at Rafik and saw that he was clutching his cutting tool as if it were a weapon, an ultimately futile instinct. If there was something there with them, it couldn't be stopped by brute force. They needed another way. Katya checked the ship schematics on her visor. There was a second emergency hatch in the medical bay, located on the opposite side of the Ardent Dawn. But that meant crossing the heart of the ship, the central reactor. The thought of approaching the power core of a vessel lost to the void so long ago was unsettling. But it was their only option. Mercer tried to dissuade them, his voice trembling with static on the unstable channel. Systems were failing one after another. The longer they stayed on board, the greater the risk. Katya didn't reply. She simply started walking, forcing herself to ignore the invisible weight pressing on her shoulders. Rafik hesitated for an instant before following her. Every footstep echoed along the metal corridor. The silence was nearly absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. But beneath the hum of electrical static and the distant throb of the ship's core, there was something else. Something that seemed to follow them without ever fully revealing itself. The corridor leading to the reactor core opened up before them like a dark abyss. The reinforced glass of the passage offered a view of the massive containment structure, a giant cylinder encircled by rings of metal and worn-out circuitry. Red lights flickered at irregular intervals, reflecting on the metal surface. Something wasn't right. The reactor should be completely offline, and yet it vibrated, pulsed, as though it were a living organism trying to awaken. Katya couldn't tear her gaze away. Inside the containment chamber, the shadows twisted into erratic patterns. They weren't just lighting failures. They moved on their own. Rafik gripped his communicator tightly, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. Every fiber of his being screamed to turn back. But before they could take another step, the structure around them shook. A deep, reverberating sound echoed through the walls. The floor vibrated beneath their feet. Something was waking up. Static intensified in their communicators. The voice that had whispered before now emerged again, stronger, more distorted. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of dissonant echoes, multiple tones overlapping, as if dozens of entities were trying to speak simultaneously, but without any synchronization. The transmission was coming from the reactor. The core wasn't just a power source, it was a transmitter. Rafik tried to check the readings, but his visor displayed error after error. The data made no sense. Time inside the Ardent Dawn was fragmenting. Logs from 22 years ago were appearing as though they were current, while others vanished entirely. Katya felt a sharp pain in her head, as though something were trying to force thoughts into her mind. The voice repeated, "You shouldn't be here." The vibration grew stronger. The glass of the containment chamber gave a subtle crack. Fine fissures began to spread across its surface. Katya pulled Rafik away, snapping out of the trance. They had to run. The path to the medical bay felt infinitely longer than it should have. Doors that had been open now required manual force to move, as if the ship were resisting. Mercer shouted through the communicators, trying to guide them, but his voice was lost in the interference. When they finally reached the medical bay entrance, Rafik slammed the side panel, and miraculously, the door opened. The lights flickered. The hallway beyond was a labyrinth of shadows, but they had no choice. Katya cast one last glance behind them, and saw the containment chamber's glass finally shatter. The darkness inside the reactor moved. Something emerged from it. A cold light enveloped them in the medical bay, sterile like a clinical veil. But something was off. The space should have been a refuge, a place for repair and recovery. Yet the metallic smell in the air and the sepulchral silence made it impossible to ignore that this was no longer safe. The shelves were floating, as if a sudden loss of gravity had ripped them from their positions and left them adrift. Monitors showed distorted images, oscillating between old medical records and cryptic static. Katya instinctively grabbed her arm, feeling the tension as she scanned the area with her eyes. No bodies. On a ship lost in space, a ship that should have been full of evidence of a missing crew, the absence of corpses was more disturbing than their presence. Rafik forced open the side panel and found what he was looking for. The emergency hatch was still operational, but the system demanded a manual code for release. Katya came over, her fingers hesitating on the holographic keypad as she tried to recall the standard emergency sequences for missions like this one. Rafik's breathing became audible in the communicator, but it wasn't that which made her pause. It was the reflection. In the glass of the medical chamber, amid the floating equipment and loose cables, someone was watching them. Yet there was no one there. The figure was distorted, like a silhouette projected onto a broken mirror, parts of its form contorting unnaturally. Katya whipped around, scanning every corner of the medical bay, but she found nothing except emptiness. Still, the shadow in the glass remained, and it was moving. Before they could react, the ship trembled again. But this time, it wasn't mechanical. The very space around them seemed to warp, as if the ardent dawn were being pulled by invisible forces. Mercer yelled through the communicators, his voice breaking with static and desperation. Something was happening outside. Katya ran to the lateral hatch and activated the external view. What she saw made her stomach churn. Space around the ardent dawn was no longer the same. The infinite sea of stars had been replaced by a dense, pulsating darkness, as though the ship was being dragged into a zone where light simply could not exist. Rafik cursed under his breath, eyes locked on the panel as data was wiped away in front of them, one entry after another, like time itself was being rewritten. The glass in the medical chamber cracked. Katya turned just in time to see the fissure spreading like a throbbing nerve across its surface. The reflection, whatever it was, began to move erratically, its parts twisting like a transmission error. Katya's pulse pounded in her neck. Rafik shouted something, but his voice was swallowed by the atmosphere. The glass shattered with a sharp snap, and the shadow emerged. It was tall, far too tall. It had no identifiable human features, only the impression of a humanoid shape that did not respect the physical limits of a typical body. The medical bay lights flickered, and for an instant, Katya felt she was no longer there. Echoes of voices not her own, images of memories that did not belong to anyone still alive, flooded her mind. The ardent dawn was not just lost in space, it was lost in time. Rafik grabbed her arm and pulled her away, forcing her to remember that they were still alive, still there. Katya blinked, trying to push away the invasive images. They had to leave, now. The shadow moved, but it did not walk. It glided, projected across the floor like a reflection without origin, a memory refusing to vanish. Katya tapped the emergency hatch commands, her fingers trembling. Codes. They needed the codes. The voice returned to the speaker, but it was no longer a warning. It whispered something intelligible, words that made every hair on Katya's body stand on end. You never left this place. The environment around them wavered. Gravity cut out for a second, and the world seemed to collapse. Rafik fought against the force pulling them backward. The shadow dissolved and reformed at each moment, unable to maintain a fixed shape. Mercer was shouting instructions, but his voice was disintegrating. Time inside the ardent dawn was completely breaking down. If they didn't leave now, perhaps they never would have left, never would have arrived, never would have existed. Space around the ardent dawn was fracturing. Time, once linear and absolute, had become a malleable entity, flowing in impossible directions. Katya felt her own consciousness being pulled to places she couldn't comprehend, as if her mind were caught between the present and echoes of pasts that weren't hers. The shadow remained, shifting between undefined forms as if testing different versions of itself. Rafik struggled to keep the hatch open, but the controls no longer responded. It was as if the ship had been severed from reality, drifting in a zone where physical laws made no sense. A voice whispered again in the intercom, but this time there was no static. It was a voice that belonged to the ardent dawn, not a computer, not a missing crew member. The ship itself. You have always been here. Katya gritted her teeth, refusing to believe. Yet part of her knew something was wrong from the start. The ardent dawn wasn't just a derelict drifting in space. It was a beacon for something far older, a mechanism of attraction, a remnant of a technology humanity should never have touched. Now they were trapped, ensnared by what the ship truly was. The shadow advanced slowly, each step altering the space around them. The medical bay was no longer the medical bay. Katya blinked and saw herself in a corridor she did not recognize, yet it felt disturbingly familiar. The monitors displayed images of her, of Rafik, and of Mercer, but from different moments, different missions, different versions of the crew, faces they had never seen, but which seemed to know exactly who they were. In one quick reflection, Katya saw her own face, but it wasn't hers. The skin was aged, eyes marked by the exhaustion of decades she had never lived. Rafik shouted, snapping her back to reality. He was holding a device that should have been deactivated, yet it glowed with impossible intensity. Mercer's voice was fraying into interference, repeating the same urgent plea. We have to get out. We have to get out. We have to get out. The phrase echoed like a broken mantra, a voice that could have been his or any other version of him. Katya turned her gaze toward the shadow, and for a moment, she understood. The thing before her wasn't a being, it was a reflection. A projection of the infinite attempts the crew had made to escape, each failure recorded and transformed into a fragment of that entity. But that meant there was a chance, a single chance. The device flared in Rafik's hands, the bridge shuddered, the emptiness around them shattered. For a brief second, Katya saw the stars reappear. Time resumed its course, and then a deafening silence fell. When she opened her eyes again, she was floating in space, far from the ardent dawn. Rafik was beside her. Mercer, pale and motionless, was in his emergency suit. The ship, or what was left of it, slowly vanished, as if it had never been there. But the voice still echoed, very faintly in the distance. You have always been here. Do you think they really escaped? Or will this story repeat itself? Leave your comment.